Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back to the Wednesday night 416 class. We're continuing our series from Flex, God Looks at the Heart, by Glenn Newton. And so we are on lesson 12. And this is the second to last one. So we got one more after this, and we're done with the series. And then we'll have some announcements at that time as well to let you guys know what we're up to after we're done with this one, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of different things going on at that time. So you guys also know the drill out there. We're gonna talk about the lesson content, Janelle and I, for the first sort of half hour here, and then we've got tonight Paul and Jaiden, as always, and also the return of Savannah and Hayden, who are going to be joining us for Bible Book Club later in the class time. So yeah, I think that's everything for right now. And so we're just going to jump right into it. So lesson 12 this week is called The Heart of a Leader. And so last week we talked about the heart of a friend, and we talked about Jonathan and David and Jonathan's but very selfless sacrifice in being the intermediary for David in the midst of being persecuted by Saul. Tonight we're going to kind of move on from that a little bit later on, and we're going to talk about the stories that happen within chapters 22 to 26 of 1 Samuel. We're not going to read all of those because that's a lot. We'd just spend the entire hour reading if we did that. So we're not going to do that. So we're going to be sort of cherry picking a few verses here and there, and then summarizing the story as we go along. But we're going to be talking about the heart of a leader. And so we're deep in the persecution of David by Saul at this point. Saul wants to kill David, plain and simple, wants him dead. And he's going about it in a variety of ways. But the big deal thing about Saul right now is that he is angry. Mm-hmm. He is angry. He's very upset. And David, on the other hand, he's on the defensive. He's trying to see reason, to find reason. He's trying to find an amicable way of resolving this tension between him and the king, while at the same time knowing that he's the rightful next king, and the rightful sort of claimant to the throne. So there's a lot going on, and we're going to talk about that tonight. But the heart of a leader, and we're going to see how David's examples apply to us now. You know, before we've been talking a lot about the stories themselves, kind of discussing the characters, the players in each of these stories, and how they could have done things one way or the other, or how they could have just chosen different things. But tonight we're going to move a little bit past that, and even during our Bible Book Club discussion with our guests, we're going to be talking about these traits of leadership and how they apply to us today, like right now. Because that's going to be the really important takeaways out of this lesson. So 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 25 is going to be our key verse, and it says, "Then Saul said to David, 'May you be blessed, David, my son. You will do great things and surely triumph.' So David went on his way, and Saul returned home." So we've got kind of the end there. Mm-hmm. We're talking about the end from the beginning here. Because those are really kind words on Saul's.
For someone that's trying to kill you, those are very kind words.
It ends up being this moment of like concession from Saul, where he finally admits that David is going to be the rightful claimant to the throne, that things are going to improve under David's reign, and that his time is up. Mm-hmm. That Saul's time as king is up. So and we'll get into that in a little bit. So. But first, if you ask the question, what makes a good leader, right? Because we're talking about David being a good leader. And we know that David is a good leader. Like he's held up as an example right there with King Solomon as people who are good leaders. But if you ask somebody that, it is safe to say that you're going to hear a variety of answers, right? Some would say that it requires strength, right? Determination, perseverance, for instance. And those are all correct answers. But, you know, those are easy things to have when things are going well. And and I don't want to veer too much into the current events in the world, but we have just gone through a time where we were asked, like, what makes a leader fit, for the nation in terms of presidents and like senators and representatives and all those things. And we've had to think about that. Now, and I'm not going to go into the details about that right now, but we've had to think about what makes a good leader. And in the case of our government, where we have a representative democracy, where we elect people to represent us on our behalf, we've had to consider, well, what makes a good leader that could represent my interests? And it's easy to have strength. It's easy to have determination. It's easy to persevere when things are going well. Mm-hmm. But it's the times of adversity when real leaders show their true mettle. And I would say right now we're going through a tough time of adversity as a whole, with the pandemic, of course, but also economically and in other ways too. Being kind of away from everybody and having to do all this remotely, that is a time of challenge. So anybody can be a captain when the seas are smooth, right? Because you just set sail, let's go. That's it. So I'm gonna go back to 2013. That's when we started dating. But in 2013, a movie came out. It's called Captain Phillips, and Tom Hanks plays Richard Phillips, the captain of the Merced, Alabama cargo ship. And if you haven't seen that movie, or if you haven't heard of that, Captain Phillips is the captain of this cargo ship, and they get boarded by Somali pirates. And as maybe you've heard, Somali pirates can be very, very dangerous. Lots of carnage happens when those pirates get involved. So with that movie, Captain Phillips shows these incredible leadership skills. And so we took a quick look into the life of the real Captain Phillips, not Tom Hanks, but the real guy. And the movie only shows us a small glimpse of what it means to be a real captain. They were able to survive the attack from the Somali pirates because they were prepared for the enemy. There was an interview with the New York Daily News in 2013 with Captain Phillips, and he said that he always told his crew, it's a matter of when, not if. It's a matter of when, not if. He knew the enemy could attack at any time. And so in chapters 22 to 29 of 1 Samuel, just kind of through the end, more or less through the end of 1 Samuel, right? David faces a powerful enemy in King Saul. And so David was ready and poised to take Saul's throne, and he knew it, and Saul knew it. So he tries time and time again to take David's life, because if you eliminate the person trying to go after your throne, then guess what? You get to keep your throne. For the most part, that's how it works. Yet even in the midst of the stormy period, David shows great strength, determination, and perseverance. And those are key traits for a leader, especially in times of adversity. So let's talk about the animosity of Saul, shall we? What do we make of that?
It seems to come from a place of just real paranoia.
Yes, yeah. Saul really gets very paranoid in the end here. You sort of see this guy who, when we first met him, he's like scared, he's hiding in the luggage, and we made fun of that. But over the chapters ensuing that, we see this guy kind of deteriorate.
Yeah, his fear goes from just being afraid to do things to just being afraid of everything around him. Yep.
Being afraid of everything. So, and not only that, but like being jealous too. Mm-hmm. Especially when other people rise up and do something that maybe he should have been the one to do. So Saul's envy and his jealousy caused him to seek David's life on 3 separate occasions. So in our previous lesson, we talked about David and Jonathan, and in that story, Jonathan served as a mediator, and Saul makes a promise to Jonathan. Remember that? He makes an oath before God in 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 6, and he says, As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. And that's, again, 1 Samuel 19, verse 6. So he promises in God's name that nothing is going to happen to David. But we only need to turn our Bibles just a page or two later to see how quickly he changes his mind. In chapter 20, verse 31, he says, as long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. And this is, again, Saul talking to his son Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
So from one chapter to the next, just in the course of one chapter, we have Saul making an oath to his son that David will not be put to death, and then reneging on that oath and making a second oath. And this one is mostly true, in that as long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Because he knows what the threat is. He knows what the threat to his reign is. It's David. David is the Lord's anointed. I mean, we saw early on in our series how Samuel was sent by God to anoint the son of Jesse.
Mm-hmm.
And that's David. So Saul went as far as to tell his soldiers why David was not the ideal choice for a king. In, again, 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 7, he says, listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Which is absurd, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is absurd. Like, no, of course David is not going to make all of them commanders. Of course David isn't going to give them fields and vineyards and all those things. But Saul's tactic here is to diminish David's reputation, right? Because of this jealousy, because of this anger that he's got. Or basically this long list of screw-ups that he's done over the course of his reign. Saul's desperation to kill David is evident by his actions as well. Also in chapter 22, Saul finds out that the priests of Nob had assisted David by giving him Goliath's sword and provisions for his journey. So he wanted Ahimelech and his family dead because Ahimelech was one of the priests. But his soldiers were unwilling to kill the priests. So he had an Edomite strike down not only Ahimelech, but 85 priests, the men and women of the town, its children and infants, and its cattle, donkeys, and sheep. It was gruesome, and you can read all about that in chapter 22 in verse 19.
I think it is important to mention there in that event, David he lies a little bit. He's running away. This is his grand escape, and he tells the priest that Saul has sent him on this secret mission, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And he was in such a hurry to do the king's will that he didn't bring a sword or supplies. And so the priest, of course, gives him what he needs. And then when he's questioned about it by Saul talks about, and this is where I get that he's paranoid. He's like, I know you're plotting against me. No one even tells me if my son is making an alliance with him. So of course you are. And even though the priest says, haven't I helped him a million other times because he's your he's one of your commanders and he's your son-in-law? He basically says, I had no idea. I've done this for David 100 times. Don't punish me. And then Saul just kills them all anyway.
Yeah. Well, but Saul doesn't though. He has someone else. He has a third party do it.
He has someone else
because he has to send the Edomite, right?
Mm-hmm.
He has to send the Edomite out because the soldiers didn't want to do it because of course they wouldn't.
Right. So all that to say, it's very apparent, and it's how paranoid he is of everybody. It's
paranoia. It is a complete loss of confidence Saul has completely lost the plot in terms of what he's supposed to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, please.
No, for sure. That's really good. So he had declared war on David. Mm-hmm. Really, that's the bottom line here. And we see this come to a point of critical mass in chapter 23. Saul and his men were in full pursuit of David when the Philistines attacked. And so the Philistines, here they come again. Goliath being killed by David was apparently not enough to get the Philistines. So they double back, and they're meaner and tougher than ever. So in chapter 24, David has full opportunity to kill Saul, and we're going to see this play out time and time again in during these chapters, where David has an opportune moment where he can just get rid of this problem completely, where Saul is completely unguarded, and David can strike him down if he wanted to, but he doesn't. Chapter 24, David has the full opportunity to kill Saul and put an end to this once and for all, but he chooses a more righteous way of dealing with Saul. So this is the famous relieving himself scene. So Saul is in a cave relieving himself. So, now, some scholars believe that relieving meant that he was like taking a nap.
But there's other stories in the Bible that talk about relieving oneself, and it's not taking a nap.
But the interpretation that I think most of us know / believe in is that he was peeing. And especially guys, when you're standing there and doing your business, you're very vulnerable. And girls too, when you're sitting there, you're very vulnerable. Either way, Saul was not in a position to defend himself at all. So rather than take advantage of the opportunity, David instead cuts off a small piece of Saul's robe, which is such a I don't even know.
It's a token of the.
It is such
opportunity.
A boss move, right? It's like I could, but snip here.
Well, and to even be able to cut off a piece of his robe without him noticing.
Right.
I still don't quite understand how that works.
Well, that's probably what leads some credence to the idea that relieving meant sleeping.
Maybe.
But anyway.
I don't know.
But anyway, he cuts off a small piece of Saul's robe. So here we are in 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 17 to 20. And this is kind of a key moment, because this is the first time that this happens, where David is able to kind of surreptitiously do something to Saul without Saul noticing. And Saul says, after he finds this out, he weeps, and then he says in verse 17, "You are more righteous than I," he said. "You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. You have just now told me about the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. I know you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands." So this is the first time now that Saul is admitting that this fight that he's engaged in, this war against David, is unwinnable.
Yeah. And it's still so near the beginning of when he fervently goes after David.
Yeah.
It's mind-boggling.
It's the first time that he admits this. And you'd think, like a normal person, like that would be the end of it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, okay, he realizes he's been beat. Time to retire gracefully. No, that's not what happened. So just when David thought things had eased up, he discovers that Saul is once again seeking his life. And chapter 26 is almost a repeat of 24. Saul wants David dead. David has a chance to kill him, but again spares his life. David confronts Saul. Saul says he's sorry. Wash, rinse, repeat. Right? When we read this story, we are overwhelmed by the pure animosity Saul had for God's chosen leader. I mean, by this point, Saul just has hatred, right? Just pure hatred for David and everything that he represented and everything that Saul just was not and was no longer. But even more overwhelming is how David deals with these unwarranted attacks. From David, we learn a few valuable lessons about leadership, and that's really where we want to be focused on tonight. We had to go through this story because we needed the context. But this is really what we want to focus on for the rest of class. Because, yeah, Saul is mad. He's mean. He's cruel. He wants to kill David. We get that. We know that, redemption really doesn't come for Saul. Mm-hmm. Not really. Because he He's adamant about it almost through to the end. But the way David handles the situation, that's the example that we want to take away from this. So let's talk about those leadership lessons from David. So every leader that God has appointed to lead in his kingdom has faced opposition. I mean, of all the apostles that Jesus chose to lead in the early church, of all 12, only one died of natural causes. Only one. Some others were beheaded, some others were crucified. One of them was crucified upside down. Only one died of natural causes. And even then, that was after being boiled in a cauldron of hot oil and banished to a deserted island.
Yeah.
Seriously, just insane. Yet often in today's church, we act surprised when there's conflict. It was like, what? God's people are fighting again. Surprise, surprise. The fact is that Satan works overtime to help us forget that we're on the same side. We're on the same side. Saul forgot that he and David were on the same side, and this gave the enemy, in this case the Philistines, an opportunity to attack. And the casualties were great. Saul was so distracted by his blind hatred of trying to kill David that he loses so many men in the process. So many good soldiers die because the Philistines, rightfully so, find an avenue of attack, and they're able to prolong this war that the Israelites were waging against the Philistines and vice versa. Saul forgot that David and him were on the same side. So the casualties were great. So when those in God's kingdom are at war with one another, and I think that's a particularly salient point these days.
I think there's always something.
There's always something, but I think we can pinpoint specific things. Not gonna, but I think we could. It gives the opportunity of the enemy to attack, and when the enemy attacks, there are always casualties. So the way David handled these unwarranted attacks shows us much about the heart of a leader. So the fact is, you really don't know the heart of a leader until conflict arises and they are unjustly attacked. Like we said at the beginning, it's easy to be a captain when the seas are still, when everything is calm, the sun is out, there aren't any clouds, and the wind is blowing in the right direction. It's easy to be captain. But it's when you hit the storms, when you hit the hurricanes, the lightning, thunder, and everything, darkness, that's when true leaders show what they're capable of. From David's response to Saul, we learn what it means to have the heart of a leader. And so there are 4 main points that we want to talk about. 4 main takeaways from David's ability to show us leadership, right? So first, true leaders pray in times of conflict. True leaders pray in times of conflict. As we read through the story of Saul and David, and I highly encourage you to read chapters 22 to 26. As you read through that story, you can't help but notice that David always seems a step ahead of Saul. Why is that?
Because he inquired of God what he should do.
He inquires of the Lord. This is because he was in prayer about the situation. That's kind of the quote from this time that cements what David was doing. Every so often, David inquired of the Lord to figure out what he needed to do next. So this is a common phrase. So instead of planning his strategy, he asks God for direction. So true leaders pray in times of conflict. Number 2, true leaders don't get distracted from the prime objective. You have a job that you've been set out to do, right? And as a leader, it's your job to make sure it gets done or the thing happens. If you're a true leader, you do not get distracted from that. So even though David was under attack from within, from his own people, from his own king, he never forgot that the mission was to destroy the Philistines and defend Israel. That's what he was sent out to do. That's why he was a commander. After the thing with Goliath, he gets promoted. He gets sent out to lead. And he doesn't forget that the Philistines were the true enemy that Israel had to be united against. Often in the church, leaders are so distracted by conflict, they forget what the mission of the church truly is, which is, of course, to spread the gospel, right? To bring more people into the flock. But if you're being distracted by squabbles, petty or otherwise, in the church, you might be falling short of being a true leader. So true leaders don't get distracted from the prime objective. That was number 2. Number 3, true leaders use love instead of force. That one's really hard. That one's really hard to do. We want to use force. We want to just ram through the thing we know for sure is true and right and accurate. And I know what I'm doing, so you should do it the way I say so. But that's not true leadership. That's not true leadership. And I'm sure all of you have horror stories of managers at work who just forced through what they wanted instead of listening and collaborating with their employees to figure out solutions together. David could have easily used force on Saul. In fact, as we discussed, the scriptures cover multiple times in which David had the upper hand, the opportune moment. A little slice here, a little stabby there. Saul is gone. He had the opportunity to end his problem on 2 separate occasions, and yet he chose to reason rather than attack. So one of President Abraham Lincoln's associates scolded him rather severely for being soft on his enemies. He said, "Why do you insist on trying to make friends of them? You should be trying to destroy them." Lincoln famously replied, "Am I not destroying my enemies when I make them my friends?" The enemy is destroyed, but now they're your friend. They're still alive. They're still able to contribute. They're still able to collaborate and to grow. But the enemy is destroyed once you make them your friend. And multiple times, David does exactly that, tries everything he can to find ways to reason with Saul. And Saul kind of accepts it a couple of times, but then he was so far gone.
Fleeting thing.
It was a fleeting thing, you're right. But David does everything he can to use love instead of force. Because true leaders use love instead of force. That's number 3. Number 4, true leaders forgive and look for the best in those who oppose us. So in the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, Jesus tells us to love our enemies. But long before Jesus ever even said those words, David demonstrated love for his enemies. David had no reason to love Saul. And in the eyes of most, he would have been completely justified if he'd attacked. Right? Mm-hmm. But David loved Saul. David loved his king.
And his father-in-law.
And his father-in-law, which is another really important thing to remember about their relationship. But David loved his king. David loved his father-in-law. David loved his brother, Jonathan. And he looked for another way out of the situation. True leaders forgive and look for the best in those who oppose us. So again, first thing we can learn from David is that true leaders pray in times of conflict. Ask God for direction instead of trying to go at it by yourself. 2, true leaders don't get distracted from the prime objective. Because if you're not doing the thing that you're supposed to be doing, then you're not being a good leader. True leaders use love instead of force. Because the end result is that more people are brought in who can collaborate and bring forth good ideas and bring solutions, and that's more people that can benefit from whatever good you're able to do. And number 4, true leaders forgive and look for the best in those who oppose us, because that's what keeps us from falling down the same hole of darkness that Saul did, because he was not looking for the best in David. He just assumed that David was going to take his throne, and that was it. So David's response to Saul is a great example, because at the end of the story, Saul dies honorably, at least from what we're told in 1 Samuel. We know in 2 Samuel It's a little different. But he dies at the end honorably in the sense that he was not,
at least fighting the right end.
yeah,
right?
yeah, he was not overthrown or anything like that. David saw the bigger picture. He not only saw what would be best for God's kingdom, but what would be best for Saul. True leaders understand that those who oppose them have souls too. That's the thing. Every single person that has ever opposed you, that has ever gotten in your way, that has ever pushed against you, is also a person with their own soul, made in the image of God. And we often forget that. We often forget that when we are so drawn in to the things we want to get done. But true leaders remember that people like Saul have souls. David knew that if he killed Saul, he would no longer have the opportunity to help him turn his life around before it was too late, that there would be no chance anymore. Sometimes we just want a quick end to the conflict. We just want things to be done, back to normal, or even back to a previous version of things. And of course, because that's what's familiar, that's what's easy, you don't want to deal with conflict for too long. It drains you. It's difficult. You have to make hard choices. You have to suffer. There might be casualties. But we fail to see the casualties then that might arise from the hasty actions. Trying to just end it because it's a quick end isn't necessarily the best thing that can be done when you're dealing with conflict. True leaders are not surprised by unwarranted attacks. As Captain Phillips said, it's not a matter of if, but when. One amazing fact about Captain Phillips' story is that being prepared to lead during the time of conflict, every single crew member on his ship survived the attack from the Somali pirates. They were able to make it through and to be okay. But it was because he was prepared. He was prepared. When God's leaders are prepared, souls survive. And even if our enemy does not ask for our forgiveness, we will still be blessed by God for doing what is right. Because that's what matters, for us to be doing what is right. So those are the lessons that we can take from David and what it means to have a heart of a leader. And so we're going to invite our friends to join us again here for Bible Book Club. So we've got, like I said before, Paul and Jaiden. Hi, guys.
Hey.
Thanks for joining us again. And once again, Savannah and Hayden. Hi. All right. So you guys know the drill. All of you have been with us for at least a few classes. First, sort of raw thoughts about this.
I think when thinking about the perspective of David as a leader, it wound up making me kind of remember the times, like all the different positions he's been in, kind of thing. Like especially with the David and Goliath thing, and I feel like another part of being a leader that David has so well represented is him like being on the front lines, being the servant, being at the bottom of the bottom. And that's something reciprocated in a lot of cases. Of course, like Jesus reciprocated that a lot, but it's like another thing where I think about like how many times have I heard friends talk about like the managerial positions and stuff, and it's like, oh, they just brought in some random outside person who doesn't know anything. It should be this guy who started at the bottom and knows everything, kind of thing. And like there's a lot of credit to that perspective, because it does humble us, and they do understand the magnitude of everything and really have a deep understanding of everything that goes on, kind of thing. You do have that, like for some people, they do have that forced humility of the situation, and when they really step up and work to solve problems, you can feel the sincerity and you can feel the care. because they've been there, because they've proven themselves on the front lines and have done everything, like have done all the hardships that the people currently deal with, kind of thing. And that brings about a lot more respect as well.
Definitely.
I think the thing that kind of resonates with me, and I like making these parallels, so it might get a little old, but looking at
We've only got one more of these left, so go for it.
Looking at how Saul decided to lead, it was very much, and I've said it before, very much under the pressure of the people. Like, people pressured him into the role of leadership. He fell under pressure when it came to sacrifices and what was saved in battles and what wasn't. And we talked about this too, like he would consult people instead of God, even though God was right there to help him along the way. And David, through these chapters, and you guys should, I don't know if you guys read them, but like he definitely shows, like he inquires of God where to go and what to do. When confronted by his soldiers, by people, and pressured to kill Saul while he had the chance, he was like, no, I'm not going to do any harm by my hand. Like, this is the Lord's anointed. And until it's God's timing, I'm not going to do it. Like, God will take care of it. But that was a lot of pressure from people that all of a sudden he was leading. And I think it would have been really easy for David to be like, oh, if I do this, I ensure that these people are loyal to me. Because this is just a side note, but I think it speaks a lot to this. These people that are with David, like I think he has some real soldiers that followed him out. Because we know when he escapes, there's people with him, but we don't know who. But then people start flocking to him. And it says in the chapter, it's like anyone who like owed anything or were disgruntled. So like David basically becomes this Robin Hood of mountains, and like people come to him and like stay with him and help him. And all of a sudden they're like pressuring him. And instead of giving into the pressure, he's also molding these people to be more godly because they have to follow someone who's choosing to be more godly.
Yeah. Well, and that's what leads to Saul talking to his men and saying, like, what, you think he's going to get you all vineyards? Or do you think he's going to get you all like this, all this stuff? Yeah.
But that's kind of my first impression. Just like David's attitude is always on God and making sure he stays pure in the eyes of God and knowing that God will take care of the rest.
Yeah. Bless you.
Do you think that's because David was like a shepherd, so he was used to just being by himself all the time? So when people are just like talking to him, he's like, oh, just sheep. And he's just kind of like tuning it out. He's just like there, like talking to himself. He's like, should I do this? And
just a sheep anyway. You know what? I think that's a really good point, because I actually would 100% say yes, for sure. That's part of his ability to be this kind of a leader definitely stems from the ability to lead sheep, because sheep are dumb.
And they get into a lot of trouble.
And they get into a lot of trouble. They do. And you know what else is dumb and gets into a lot of trouble? People. Like we do that all the time too. And David is definitely equipped because of that. And I am sure that is a huge part of why he's able to tune out some of those like requests and demands from people. Is like, no, he can say, no, you don't need that.
I do admire his humility in confidence. I feel like a lot of times we feel like you're either humble or you're like confident and like showboaty, if that, you know what I mean? Yeah. But like David at this point, like after being a shepherd and then being a commander, like he's made tough decisions and people have to follow him into those decisions. And so I can appreciate this kind of refined aspect of his leadership where he can be humble, knowing that as long as Saul is alive in his eyes, he's still God's anointed. I'm not sure exactly where he got that, like, because obviously he was anointed, he's been told he's the rightful king and all of these things, but instead he's like, no, this man is still alive, he's still my king. and I don't have to kill him. Yes, I could kill him,
And it would be advantageous to do so.
but I don't have to. And that's where you see all the self-control come into play.
Yeah.
So that's interesting to me, because I think, at least I have a hard time being humble and confident at the same time.
Well, and it makes David's like later sins that much more tragic.
That's true.
Like later when we find out, of him,
His own schemes.
of him cheating with Bathsheba and all of those things, the adultery and all of that, it makes the context of what's going on now in his early life just makes all of that stuff so much more tragic, because it's like you had the self-control. You could overcome this, but you couldn't over here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, David is a great example for great leadership, but again, he's not a perfect man.
Right. Yeah.
He's not a perfect man. Any other sort of raw thoughts about this or about the heart of the leader?
I was kind of remarking to Savannah earlier about how I was noticing, well, especially between Saul and David, you can see just like the shift. Saul feels to me like somebody out of like Judges, like he's just the king that's just not quite the king.
Yeah.
And here's David, but you're seeing like the shift through Saul almost, from like Judges shifting into kings, because Saul here is trying to solve the issues by like committing atrocities, just murdering people in order to like try to get back at David essentially. And here David, where if we were back in Judges, he would have struck down Saul in an instant the second that he had him at his mercy. But here we see there's like a different way, and it's, I don't know, it's just interesting to me to see like the shift into, not that like David is the like the final form of like the perfect king, because he does have his own issues, and then Solomon and everybody else later on, but it's, I don't know, it's just neat to see the shift through Saul, sort of.
I really appreciate that perspective, because I think you're right. It's like Saul is like the prototype king.
Yeah.
And it's like, but it's not like a great prototype. It's like a software that's not even in beta yet. Like there's still a lot of bugs in it. Like it doesn't listen to you all the time, and it kind of doesn't do what it's supposed to. But like David is like the much more improved version of what this new thing is. And I think you're right. You see this transition, and I think we're meant to, because like Samuel is effectively the last judge.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's a prophet, but he is effectively like the last of the judges.
And he does die within these chapters.
And within these chapters, that's when Saul dies. I mean, Samuel dies.
I think that's interesting too, because we, even God says like, you're going to choose a man. Like I'll show him to you, but it's going to be the type of man that you as humans would choose. And then I'm going to choose somebody, and you'll still get your king, but I'm going to choose him.
Yeah. And
I think it's interesting that God still was that lenient about it. He was like, yeah, here's your really bad prototype. And then like, here's David. And yes, he's going to have his issues, because God promised that all the kings were going to not be what they needed to be to lead people. But at least he chooses David and sets up the line of Jesus right there. It's like, so you're going to go through all these problems, but I'm going to fix it over here.
It's funny that you say that like God was lenient with this, because I think God was outright kind. Like if this is the same God that to make a point, like let people wander in the desert for 40 years. Like if it takes the 20 or so years that Saul is king to make the point of who your true leader is.
I'm not saying that he's the one that made the point, because obviously there were a lot of kings after him. He was the worst one in respect of like there were high hopes and they all get dashed, and like we can see the fear and the paranoia. And then all these other kings it talks about, he was a good king and followed the ways of David. He was an evil king. He was an evil king. Like we have much detail about them. It takes a long time until we get to Jesus to be like, oh, so there's a long time to make that point still. But it seems like God sets it up really early in the game, I guess.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks everybody. Those are some really good thoughts. So let's talk about leadership now as like a quality, and despite David's example, let's just talk about leadership in general and like the heart of a leader and how we can talk about that regarding ourselves like now, today, like in the church now, or even in our personal lives outside of the church setting. Because, you know, we're always at church, but like outside of like the congregate setting. Like, what are your thoughts there?
A leader is a what is it? I think it's so important. I mean, kind of what I was saying before is like I think it's so important to keep the heart of a servant, or more than like a delegator kind of thing.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point, because like ultimately David, while he was still kind of running away from Saul, he saw himself as a servant. You know, what I said before, that the true leader doesn't get distracted from the prime objective. He was dealing with all the Saul problem while at the same time fighting a war with the Philistines. And yeah, and I think you're right. I think the heart of a servant ties very, very closely to the heart of a leader. And today, sure, we may not be literally fighting wars, but you know, we still have to serve other people. And ultimately, a leader is just a servant with more jobs, right? Can we all agree on that? Because like, you know, I going back to real quick to the example of like in our like secular lives, our secular work, you know, when we have a manager that kind of comes in and tries to ram through like policies and ideas and stuff, it's like, you know, you got to remember, the manager has to remember eventually that like, you know, I don't work for you. You kind of work for me, in the sense that you're the one helping me do my job. You know, you're the one making sure that I'm able to do my function, and ultimately we're able to serve the customer, or, you know, the shareholder, or whatever it is that the company's doing, or the clients, whatever. Like a good manager is also kind of a servant.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think a good leader is very compassionate. They're compassionate on themselves, but for other people too. We see this in the story in these chapters too, is people do get killed and hurt for helping David. And when Saul does have that priest and his family and basically the whole town killed, a son gets away and he runs to David. And David takes complete responsibility for what happened. He's like, it's my fault, like that this happened to this community. I knew that this one individual who was with Saul would snitch on me, basically, and this is the result. So, and he tells the son of the priest, like, stay with me. You're going to be safe with me. This was my fault. So, like, the compassion he has on other people, even the people that were rallying to him, and we don't get more description than just they owed money or they were disgruntled. And, like, to have compassion on people who are maybe sound rough around the edges like that, and, like, let them be part of your following is even a difficult thing to do sometimes. Because I think as leaders, we feel like we have to maintain this certain image so people respect us and follow us. And here's David, like, you owe money? You don't like the way things are? What happened to you? Your whole community died? Okay, like, let's go. Like, he's leading all these people with kind of their own side issues, but he unites them against, like, the Philistines, like, pointing back to kind of the prime objective. And I think it's important to remember, like, it's not so much about, like, yes, you want to do well as a leader and you want to make good choices, but the people following you, it's not their job to make you look good or keep your reputation good.
Yeah.
Well, and kind of going into that, like, just meeting people and having people who might be, you know, disgruntled and angry and frustrated. Like, as a leader, with somebody coming to you with all these problems, I imagine you need patience. Not to get overwhelmed with somebody going, hey, hey, listen to my sob story. Like, if it's something, you know, being a little dramatic, I guess. But, you know, listen to my story, listen to my complaints, listen to my problems. That gets exhausting sometimes, like if you have a lot of people doing that. So I can't imagine the amount of patience David might have had to have. Yeah.
Well, like Savannah said, I think, you know, with him having had the experience of being a shepherd, that instilled that in him. But I think at some point or another, you know, we should put ourselves in that position of being a shepherd where we do have to build up our patience. You know, the Church of Christ joke is always like, don't pray asking for patience, because what God will send you are tests instead. But it's true. Like, that's the only way you build up that patience. That's the only way you build up that tolerance to be able to serve in that way. And, you know, it is to our benefit if we are able to throw ourselves into kind of menial, quote unquote, menial work, where we're kind of like shepherds, or we're looking after something that is dumb and makes bad decisions all the time, you know, to build up that patience and that tolerance so that you can serve effectively and to lead effectively. Ideally to cut down the amount of people making bad decisions and being dumb. Yeah, so any further thoughts there, Hayden or Savannah?
I guess it just takes time. Like, you don't become like a patient person or a leader overnight. Like, if you look back at different like jobs or like experiences within your life, you can probably see how that contributed or like gave you some amount of like patience or leadership abilities. And so like with David, he definitely wasn't a perfect leader, but he was like learning as he went. So he just like took the opportunity and ran with it. So it's just important to be like willing to just do what, or just like go with the flow a little bit more often, just because there's learning experiences within whatever happens.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think to myself too, like, you know, we want to learn patience. We want to learn how to effectively have compassion for people and their situations, and to have good solutions, and to focus on the objectives and all of those things. But I also think to myself too, like, you know, the Gabby of like 15 years ago wouldn't be able to do this class right now. You know, so like I realize, like you said, looking back at all of the jobs and all of the things that I've done in my life so far that have brought me to this point where, you know, I'm able to have this class. I'm able to conduct a discussion with you guys and do some leadership here, and not be so hard on myself when I still come up short somewhere, because it did take that much time to get me to this point. You know, it wasn't like I was ready to go fresh out of high school or whatever, to do all this stuff. It took the time of having some pretty menial jobs, you know, of being yelled at, of being told I was wrong, this and that. And sometimes they were right. Many times they weren't, but sometimes they were. And getting those licks, you know, as you make your way through, to get to the point where leadership is a thing you can actively pursue. So it does take time. I think that is an important thing to remember about leadership. You can't become a leader overnight. You've got to focus. You've got to put the effort in to really learn how to do it, for sure.
So this is going a little bit, I think, further than where we read in these chapters, but I think it goes along with being a leader, and what Savannah is saying is kind of just finding the successes that come out of your failures is really hard. And David, I think, like, we're applying it to ourselves, but later in the story, we find out that David and his men have been kind of like guarding these other shepherds that belong to this wealthy man. And they've basically like made a fortress around them, and they didn't harm them. They never stole anything from them. They like took care of them while they were out there. And David, we find out, did this because later he's going to ask this man for supplies for his men. And the wealthy man basically says, like, who is this man? No one knows. No one cares. I'm not going to, like, give my resources to him. And David is mad. He's going to go. He tells his men to, like, strap on their swords. We're going to go and we're going to take care of this because, like, how he's treating us so poorly for how well we've treated him. And we need supplies. So he's going to go and, like, kill everybody and just take the supplies at this point. But the man's wife finds out, and she brings all the supplies to him and asks for David's forgiveness. And she lets him know, like, I know who you are. I know what God is doing. You know, please take this food, these supplies. And for David to be able to, like, calm himself and have that compassion, have the sight to know, like, to just roll with this new punch that's come along and to say, you know, I grant your request. Thank you for the food. Go in peace. Like, that's a success that came out of a failure. He's basically on his way saying, like, this man, like, so much for us taking care of him. Look how he's repaying us. And then she shows up and reassures him, like, no, I know what God's doing through you. I know what's happening. I know
what you need.
I know what you can do to us, and I know what you need. So let me give you what you need. Nothing but respect. Please let us live. And I think that's, like, a really good example of something good coming out of what would seemingly be a failure and someone kind of looking down on you. Like, who is this person? I don't owe them anything. So I don't know. I just thought that went well with what you were saying.
All right. So in the last, like, 2 or 3 minutes that we've got here, any other sort of final thoughts? I think we might be out of time to really get into this, but I did want to talk a little bit about, and maybe we can just get into it real quick, but talking about how what happens when God's people are at odds with each other. Mm-hmm. When we do come across that conflict, or sometimes when we even are part of the conflict. So how does that kind of work out, and how does that leave the opening for Satan for, like, the bad things to kind of come out of that?
Did you have something?
What?
No, you made, like, a peace sign, like you had something.
No.
I don't know. I was gonna say, when you're holding, these people should be your brothers and your sisters, you know, and when you're holding, like, a certain animosity in your heart, you're like, well, you're at, like, risk of either chasing somebody away or being chased away yourself, you know. It not only, like, reflects badly upon yourself, it, like, reflects badly upon everybody. There's, like, sweeping generalizations. I don't know, you can go down the rabbit hole, but it's like when like, that animosity starts to, like, pour out between people that should be closest to you, I don't know, it leaves, like, a lot of leeway for you to hurt people, whether it's, like, meaningfully or unmeaningfully.
Yeah, for sure. It's really dangerous. It's really dangerous to fall into the traps of animosity, of conflict, within sort of our family of people who are supposed to be on the same side, who are supposed to be focused on, again, the prime objective of furthering God's kingdom. So how do we deal with that then? How do we deal with that? I know I'm asking you guys to, like, solve all the problems, but, like, how do we deal with that?
I think you can take that as a growing opportunity, because it could be, like, a communication failure, or, like, a patience issue, or just like a pride issue. But a lot of times, I don't know, it feels bad to say, but it's just kind of like you need to grow in yourself so that you can get over it. Because sometimes there are things that happen where somebody does something really, like, bad or horrible. And in those situations, like, you can take, or, like, the biblical example, I guess, would be to, like, approach somebody else about it and just, like, ask for advice, or, you know, you can like ask for help, but with like mundane things, I think you should just improve your patience, or actually learn how to communicate with people, or learn how to apologize, or just kind of like learn how to tune things out, just because like it's not always like, you shouldn't make it about somebody else when God's presenting you with something in yourself as well.
That's a really good point.
And I think, I mean, obviously not all conflict is bad. And even with David and Saul's conflict, the conflict was very one-sided. Like, obviously David got pulled into it and he's trying to explain, trying to understand. And I think sometimes there's conflicts where we won't understand why someone decides to just be so persistent in this one way of doing things, this one way of being, this one way of thinking. And you can do the best you can to peacefully communicate and have that conflict. But at some point, I think sometimes you just have to understand, like, there's different places, there's different things to do in the church, different places to grow in the church. And maybe this is just something that you have to work around, and maybe it'll circle back and it'll get resolved, and maybe it won't. Maybe you'll just learn to live with that conflict until God resolves it in another way, if you've done the best you can. But ideally, you can, like Savannah said, like, kind of duke it out, talk it out, figure it out, and at least come to an understanding, even if it doesn't end in agreement.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for being here. Like I said, we have one more lesson in our series before we're done, and then we'll be done with this, and we'll move on to some other thing. And our final lesson is the heart of a champion. Heart of a champion.
Ooh.
Yeah. It's I feel like there's like a Wheaties joke in there somewhere. I don't know. But anyway, I know our camera got blurry, but at the end anyway. So the Heart of a Champion is next week. Thank you, Jaiden and Paul, for being with us again, and thank you, Hayden and Savannah, for being with us. And that's it for us tonight. Thank you guys for watching, whether you're watching live or later on, and we will see you next week. Have a good night.